The Threefold Farm, the Threefold community, founded on a beautiful April morning such as today, 100 years ago in 1926. And over that century, it has meant so much to so many different people who may have come for a conference for a few days or a couple of weeks. Perhaps they stayed on to do a training over several years in eurythmy or in teaching or in the arts. Um, We think of all the generations of parents who dropped their children off at school or at the summer camp, and the children who may have spent 14 years going to that school, and in the summers hanging around the pond. Um, and then all the people who simply came and moved here, put down roots, built houses, came in order to teach or to care for others or to care for the land. Or perhaps simply to have to live their golden years at the fellowship community. And perhaps we just think of people who came to walk the paths and admire the gardens, or perhaps look at the cows, buy some milk, stop at the corner store, now called the co-op, and buy their groceries. It has meant so many things to so many different people. But it began that 100 years ago on that April morning when four people, we see them here, Louise Bybee on the left, Charlotte Parker, Gladys Barnett, and Ralph Courtney, left their apartments near Carnegie Hall and went over to the river, boarded a ferry, and when they got to the other side, I assume the realtor was there with his car waving at them, and they all piled in, started to head off into northern New Jersey. Northern New Jersey in those days was still very rural, but when they crossed the border into Rockland County, it was very rural. You can see here on this map that it's way up in the corner. It's only 25 miles from Manhattan, but in 1926 that was considered very far away. There were no bridges. The roads were not very good, but it had a certain charm to it. And on that day, these four turned down a dirt road evocatively named Hungry Hollow, crossed over a little bridge over the Pine Brook, and turned into a driveway. And as they spilled out of the car, they stood in front of this little white farmhouse. From there, they began to walk through the fields over these 25 acres that had been a strawberry farm. They walked past this ramshackle little barn. And when they were done, they came and sat outside of that house and pondered as to whether this might in fact be the land where they could put down their roots, where a community devoted to the land, devoted to anthroposophy, could flourish. Well, they decided that, yes, this would be the place, and Charlotte Parker took out her checkbook, and that land became theirs. But to understand the significance of that April morning, we have to begin with the people. And let's start with Ralph Courtney. Born in 1885 in Omaha, Nebraska, he was a true Midwesterner there along this tributary of the mighty Mississippi. And he always felt those deep American roots. But by the time he was a teenager, his family had brought him over to England, and he ended up in Oxford. And after studying there, moved to London to become a literary agent. One day, Max Geisy came to him with a book by one Rudolf Steiner that he wished to have published in English as the way of initiation. Ralph took that project on and then began to read Rudolf Steiner. Went over to work in Paris with the Associated Press and happened to be speaking about Steiner with his manager, Elmer Richards, who said, well, come into my office. So he did, and they pulled out this drawer, and there were all these books of Rudolf Steiner. And Elmer said, Dr. Steiner is coming here to Paris. I think you should meet him. And so it happened that in 1913, Ralph Courtney walked up the steps to an apartment and there was able to have a conversation with Rudolf Steiner. Now, many people said that from the moment that they saw him, they recognized that this was truly an enormous individuality of his age. But that wasn't exactly how Ralph saw it in those days. And nevertheless, he kept on reading. And um, World War I came, he was back in London. And after the war, he came over to become editor of the New York Herald Tribune. In that position, he was asked to go to Bern in Switzerland to report on a major labor conference. And he discovers that Rudolf Steiner is also there giving 3 lectures on the threefold social order. Well, he goes along. His German isn't very good, but he gets a sense that there's something very important being brought here. Afterwards, he manages to meet him. And then he said, I had that remarkable experience there at the end of the evening when Rudolf Steiner was holding my coat for me as I put one arm in one sleeve and the other arm in the other sleeve, and thought, here is this great man of our times bringing something important. Well, from that, he went back to Paris and began studying this threefold social order, and got a letter from Rudolf Steiner asking whether he could, in fact, take those books and have them translated into English and then published, which he did. Now, by 1921, Ralph Courtney was going often to Dornach, and there had a number of conversations, always standing in front of the representative of humanity of the statue. Well, one day in the spring of 1921, Dr. Steiner said to him, I think that you should bring your talents back to America and perhaps work for threefolding there. And Ralph immediately said, well, I'm so busy. I'm doing so many things in Paris with the newspaper. Well, Steiner asked him again, and he got the similar response. Finally asked him a third time, and Ralph said, well, what is it that you have in mind? Well, Rudolf Steiner said, we have this little company called Futurum, where we're raising money for business initiatives that in turn can help spawn cultural initiatives. And we need someone to bring this to America. Well, he thought for a moment and said, I think I'll do it. And that spring, he set sail back to America and back to New York City. Well, Ralph Courtney had a number of contacts in the journalist sphere, so he managed to actually get the threefold social order and Futurum written up in a large, full-page article in the New York Times. And the problem was that no one else was particularly interested, and Futurum really did not get off the ground. And in fact, it also failed over in Europe. Well, now here he is in New York wondering what he should do. So he decided to look up the anthroposophists, and he found his way to the group that was there, the St. Mark's group, which had been formed in 1910. That's a whole other story of the singers who went to Berlin, such as Grazia Riccardo, and got to know Rudolf Steiner, heard his lectures, and came back, brought this to New York, told their teacher, Herbert Wilbur Green, about it. And there they formed the St. Mark's group, given the name by Rudolf Steiner. He suggested it. I can only think perhaps that it had to do with that gospel in which the word immediately appears so many times. Perhaps it responded to that sense of the will impulse that lives in America. Well, now Ralph found his way to this group and began to attend Thursday meetings. There he met, for instance, Gladys Barnett, who was 23 years old. She was a concert pianist, and she was Herbert Wilbur Green's accompanist. Now, where they met was in Mr. Green's studio, which was on the 6th floor of Carnegie Hall. And one day afterwards, after such a gathering, Ralph was out walking in Manhattan with Louise Bybee, who was also attending there. She was a singer. And he says to her, this threefolding is such an important thing. What can you imagine we could do to help it incarnate in America? And her response was, she said, well, I'm staying at the Ruth Dewing School of Rhythmics. There are always students there looking for places to live. Well, what if we rented an apartment where we could rent out rooms? And so he was enthusiastic. She borrowed $200 and they suddenly had this apartment. When you walked in, there's a large living room that had a gray marble fireplace, a perfect place to put a chair and have Ralph read lectures and hold conversations. And people began to move in. Gladys Barnett decided to move in, and she had to somehow shoehorn her grand piano into a room which barely left enough room for a bed. And other people joined them, and many others came to sit there and hear lectures and have conversations that would go right on into the night. By this time, Ralph was 36. Well, soon thereafter, Charlotte Parker was walking down the street with Louise Bybee, who was her cousin, and she says, Louise, I hear that you're studying this person, Rudolf Steiner. I think it's time you tell me something about him. So she said, well, why don't you come along? And she did. And before long, she became so interested that she said, I'm going to rent my own apartment, which was a little larger apartment, a bit down the street. Now, the original apartment was just around the corner on 56th Street from Carnegie Hall. And just down the street then was Charlotte's. Charlotte Parker. Now, Charlotte was born in 1890 in Ipswich, a little bit north of Boston. When she was a teenager, she was off with her family in Berlin. They moved back to Rhode Island, and then at 17, she was studying in Dresden. She then went with her family at the age of 20, traveling a whole year around the world. Japan was a particularly important place to her, where they spent more than a month there. At the end of that, she went back to study in Boston. World War I came along, and she went over in order to work with the Medical Corps and actually was driving an ambulance during the war and working in a hospital with injured soldiers. At the end of the war, she had an apartment in Paris with a friend of hers, and she spent the next year or so wandering around France, riding her bicycle up and down the hills of France, enjoying it immensely until in 1921, she's now 31 years old. She finds herself back in New York studying interior design and art and having this apartment. Well, her apartment was a little larger, so the gatherings became bigger, and they began to have teas in the afternoon, and that would lead people to staying over for dinner. And pretty soon they formed a dinner club, but they needed someone to cook for it. Now they had 15 or 20 people showing up for dinner. Charlotte, I'm not sure she had really cooked very much in her life, said, I'll do it. And there you could see her over the stove with her Fanny Farmer cookbook and stirring away while Gladys Barnett and Louise Bybee would be discussing the intricacies of how to get sand out of spinach. And there, more and more people began to come until finally it was like 25 people. They would stay into the evening and have conversations. And finally someone said, we need to have a restaurant. Well, that was just a great idea. And Charlotte said, there's the basement here that's not occupied. What if I rent it? And we moved down there. And so they did. But if it was going to be a real restaurant, they had to deal with some problems. One is that the walls had big cracks in them. And they had to think what to do with that. So Ralph and Charlotte came up with a brilliant idea, and that was, let's paint in such a way that we'll paint up to the crack in one color and then change the color and bring it down to meet the crack there. And therefore, in the room, as you looked around, there were these fascinating little patterns of color throughout the room. They needed chandeliers, and they had to construct them out of cardboard. They needed tables and chairs, and who should walk in but Fritz Westhoff, a young engineering student. Um, and he agreed to do these and to make them. Uh, there's still a couple of chairs of those that he made that are at the Threefold Auditorium, as you can see in this picture here. This became the Threefold Vegetarian Restaurant. Early in the morning, Ralph would head up to the West Side Market to buy vegetables. Charlotte would get going early. Gladys and Louise were waitresses, along with Ella Smith joined them, and Keys Jansen came from Holland. Is this tall, blonde-haired young man who really impressed people because of how many plates that he could carry around elegantly on a tray. They decided then that they needed also to have lunches. By this time, up 100 people, then 150 people were coming to the restaurant, somehow squeezing them in there in the basement, and they began to have lunches. But I think Charlotte was probably in the middle of flipping her 12th omelet when she said, "Oh, if only we had someone else to cook as well." Well, there was a little lady from Jamaica named Vivian Clark who was working away in the kitchen. I guess she was washing dishes, and she said, "Miss Parker, I think I could do it." And she began also to cook. She would go on to cook for the Rudolf Steiner School, and then later on would cook for years and years at the Threefold Farm, where she ultimately moved. Now, this was an exciting place to be. Artists came, musicians, actors, writers, philosophers came, and they would go on talking late into the night. One day, someone came in and said, I went to a concert last night, and in came this young lady to go up and play the piano. Beautifully, she played it, but her hands were stained and red. And I asked her about it later, and she said, "Well, my name is Gladys, and I just came. I had to hurry over because we were doing dinner, and I was chopping beets." Now, it has been said that this was the first vegetarian restaurant in Manhattan. You could get a vegetable plate for 40 cents, a casserole for 20 cents. You could buy books by Rudolf Steiner. Helena Duttman came and began selling Weleda products. Meanwhile, Lucy Neuscheller was over at the Ruth Dewing studio doing Eurythmy, just down the street. And so Charlotte and others would go and participate and even go over to New Jersey and become part of this new experience of a Eurythmy in America. Now, the most notable moment in the restaurant was that of New Year's Eve, 1922. It was Gladys Barnett's birthday, and many people came. It went on and on right into the wee hours of the morning until the telegram arrived, and when they opened it, they sat there in shock to hear that the first Goetheanum was burning. When Gladys heard that, she didn't hesitate. She said, "I'm going over there." And in fact, she sold her grand piano, went to Dornach, fell in love immediately with Eurythmy, played piano for them as an accompanist. And then when Penman Mar in Wales became the site for the first annual summer school held by Dean Dunlop, she was asked to come along and play the piano. And so she did. It was a remarkable place to be, just the etheric aura of that world of northern Wales, being able to walk amidst ancient Druid sites. And there to have that experience along the stormy seacoast of hearing Rudolf Steiner speak of what could be seen there in the etheric aura of the earth. And she said the lecture hall was quite primitive, but the work that was being done was truly remarkable. They were able to go off to the islands of Anglesey and go over to Carnarvon and explore more and more of these sites, always getting the rich insights of Rudolf Steiner. And Günter Wachsmuth later said that he portrayed these ancient times, these ancient peoples, almost as if it all would appear right in front of us. Well, this was this remarkable summer that Gladys had. And when she came back, she was so full of these stories that everyone imbibed them. In 1923, Ralph Courtney wrote to Rudolf Steiner to ask for a verse for America. Well, Rudolf Steiner immediately wrote one for him, couldn't send it through the post. He had to wait for someone to be going over there. And then when Reinhard Miller announced that he was traveling to America, to New York, he said, well, would take this along. And so he presented it then to that little group of people who formed a group called the Threefold Commonwealth Group. Ralph Courtney, Charlotte Parker, Louise Bybee, Gladys Barnett, Margaret Peckham, Alice Smith, and Reinhard Miller. Now, in 1924, Ralph and Charlotte announced that they were going to go to the second annual summer school. This time it would be in Torquay, down in Cornwall. And so off they went and had that experience of many lectures, including some powerful karmic relationships lectures, and also the chance to go there to Tintagel. You can imagine what it was for Rudolf Steiner to stand there looking out over the castle that was there, that was built later, in later times, but underneath it would have been the ruins, he said, of the castle of King Arthur. And to walk over to the coast and look down to the sea, where the waves hurl themselves against the walls of the rock. And hear Rudolf Steiner speak about how out of this seething foam the elemental beings rise up into living expression. And then how the sunlight pours down and allowing Arthur and his knights to experience spiritual beings just rising out of the foam of the water beneath. This was their experience in Torquay. It was also a chance for them to meet some of the leading lights of anthroposophy in England, to meet Cecil Harwood, Owen Barfield, George Adams. They met Dunlop. And they went home inspired now ever more to do something for anthroposophy. It was one thing to be doing this from the restaurant, but how could we provide a place, perhaps a place where we could grow some vegetables for the restaurant, and in this new agriculture which had been born in that summer of 1924 there at the Kaiserlink estate, biodynamic agriculture. And how perhaps could they also make it a place where people from around the country could come and take part. And so it was that one day Ralph was talking to Constance Ling, who was also working there at the restaurant, and he said, we're considering going to the country and buying a farm. And her reaction was, but we're so busy here. We have so much to do. And you're no farmer. But nevertheless, Ralph decided to take this to Henry Munges, who was the new General Secretary of the Anthroposophical Society in America. So off he went to the headquarters, which were in the basement of the house of the Key family, whose children were playing upstairs. This was, I think, on West 72nd Street, and down below was Henry. Now we have to consider who this man, Henry Munges, was. He was born in 1870 in Texas, moved out to study architecture in Berkeley, where he worked for years. At the age now of 46, he was walking along the streets of Manhattan when he came across a bookstore. I looked in the window, and there are all these books of the same title, Occult Science by Rudolf Steiner. So we walked in and spoke to the owner of the bookstore, who then showed him other books by Rudolf Steiner, and out he walked with The Way of Initiation, which he then read, and then he read more. This was something that spoke to him. And now it was his dream to get over to Europe, Well, 1918, at the end of the war, the opportunity came. He was asked to be one of 12 American architects to go to Paris, to go to France, and help them in the reconstruction. Well, when these 12 Americans showed up, the French looked at them and said, "No, I think we'll do it ourselves." But there he is in France. Now, there was an organization that was trying to bring education to the American soldiers who were still waiting there, waiting to go home. Well, Henry Munches plunged into that. They found an old hospital, and there they began to give courses that ultimately over 15,000 American GIs took part in. In 1919, his wife Maud came to join him, and now they went off to Dornach, and they were there in September of 1920 for the opening of this marvelous building. After that, they went home, but then they heard that there was going to be a Congress in July 1922 in Vienna, led by Rudolf Steiner. So they boarded ship again, went off to Europe, and now he said they had these 10 incredible days immersed in lectures, in workshops, and artistic events, in eurythmy, endless conversations among people, drinking all of this in. It was there that he met Walter Molt. Now, Walter was the son of Emil Molt, and he would later say just how impressed he had been with Henry Munges. He said, "This man in his very youthful countenance seems to embody the youthful energy of the American continent." But there was something deep in him, something, he said, of his stature that was remarkable, somebody that he had the real pleasure to meet as a true representative of what was living in that land that he comes from. Now, the last lecture that Rudolf Steiner gave there was about the Goetheanum. And while Henry Munches had seen it before, he said, "I think now is the time when I go and I really immerse myself in the nature of this building." That wasn't at first so easy for him. And when he goes to Dornach, because he was trained traditionally as an architect, but the more he lived in that building, the more he began to understand what people said, that this was a case of a true living metamorphosis. A place where some said you could walk in at least once in your life and have this sense of how spirit actually can manifest in matter. In a building in which has, as was once said by Rudolf Steiner, it has walls but no walls, windows but no windows, as it leads you out into realms of the spirit. So he was profoundly inspired by that, and years later, Hilda Dighton and Gina Palermo would ask him to design a house for them, which he did. This is a house that now stands in Threefold Farm. If you go down Hungry Hollow Road, the last little house right before Raymond Avenue is that house. And others that came afterwards wanted to see what he had done and were always impressed by the nature of how he had taken into himself this sense of metamorphosis and had transformed it into this little building. He, of course, heard about the burning of the Goetheanum. A year later, he went with Maud back to the Christmas conference, where he was one of several Americans to be present. Henry Munges, with that very apparent fiery enthusiasm of his, was then chosen by Rudolf Steiner to become the first General Secretary of the Anthroposophical Society in America, and he did. And Henry Barnes later looked back on those years, those many years he had representing the society, and how he traveled all over the country and brought those will impulses and that sense of enthusiasm for what anthroposophy has to bring to this particular continent. So there, Ralph Courtney is now going down the steps into the basement and sitting there with Henry Munges, talking to him about the possibility of a farm where there would be vegetables grown and where there would be maybe even a home for anthroposophy. Now remember that both Ralph and Henry had experienced the Gertianum, and Henry's response, I'm sure thinking of that building there and thinking of that possibility out somewhere in the countryside, was immediately enthusiastic. To think that these young people would now, having done so much in that marvelous restaurant of theirs, would now take it and plant it somewhere in the soil of this country. So that led to April of 1926, where the decision was made that this, in fact, would be the place on that little farm in Rockland County along Hungry Hollow Road. Right away, Ralph got paint and set to work painting the outside while Gladys went and painted the inside. Every weekend, a package would arrive. Big package that was full of china and cutlery and tablecloths that were found by Charlotte Parker and packed up and sent out to this little main house. Now, Threefold has grown to be quite a substantial place in the last 100 years, but in those first months, it was a fairly lonely place. No one stayed there over that first winter. Gladys and her friend Elise Stolting announced that they were going to go over to Dornach in order to study eurythmy. And before they left, Ralph and Charlotte came to them and said, yes, but you have to find a farmer. You have to have someone who can come and help us with this land. So they went off there, and when they arrived, they immediately went up to the son of Count Kaiserlink, Aki Kaiserlink, and asked him, do you have a farmer that we could send over to America? And he just laughed and said, we don't have enough for the farms that we have here. But I think you should come and study farming yourself. Now, you don't have to make up your mind right away, but I'm leaving tomorrow, so you'll have to let me know then. And so I imagine they had a bit of a sleepless night, but the next day they were with him. And off they went all the way up to the Baltic Sea where his estate was. And they were making compost by day, and at night they were studying with Mr. Kaiserlink. Elise went back by May of that year, 1927, and immediately started digging a garden in front of that little main house. A few months later, Gladys came, and now they really dug into it. They started with bees. They went and across the brook and through the woods there and up onto the hill, and began to chop down brush and trees. I heard later that when Gladys moved to the fellowship, she was in a room where she could look out over that same field, and she saw people out there working away with chainsaws on it. And she says, we did that same kind of work with just saws and axes. So they were very busy on the farm in those months. And in Christmas, people from New York were invited out. Lots of people came and somehow squeezed into that little main house, that little white house. They put in a Christmas tree, they lit candles. It was just a very special time. That winter, the only ones who were there were just a few of them. And you would see Gladys standing below an apple tree with Keese. Now, Keese and Alice had gotten married. So Keese Johnson and Alice Smith. And he was there up in the apple tree. And you would see that Gladys would be looking at a book on pruning and look up to him and say, now take that branch over there. It was cold. There was snow on the ground, and there was a little shack where Alice was preparing a soup for them for their lunch, kind of trying to keep warm by stomping on the ground. And now we can ask ourselves, well, just how big was that land? Well, you had that little main house, you had that ramshackle red barn, and as you went there, you came over the brook through this field up onto the hill, as I described. If you turned around the other way, and you would go across Hungry Hollow Road, there was a stream coming through, and there was some area there. So it was about 25 acres. Now, there was a little apple orchard there. And I remember how 46 years ago, when Ann Stahl was moving from her house in New Jersey, she said, take all of the plantings. And a whole bunch of us young people did, piled into a truck and took them all out. And then at the end, Howard Mertens said, now we're going to take this Japanese maple, which was quite substantial. And we dug and dug and dug, and somehow a whole bunch of us got it up onto the truck, and we brought it back out and planted it there by now what is Orchard House. And as we were digging a hole there, I said, why are you digging this hole so close to this apple tree? And he said, don't worry about it. Well, we planted that tree. The next day it came down and the apple tree was gone. Howard had taken his chainsaw and done quick work of it. But how we love that Japanese maple today. And that takes us then up into that next year, 1928. And by this time, Ralph had been coming out and spending more time there. He built a building called the Summer Kitchen, which also had a big L-shaped patio on it. 1928 was also the year when finally a farmer came. Paul Strominger from Germany came. He right away bought a horse called Charlie and would be plowing the fields with him. He built a greenhouse in the back of the Summer Kitchen, and there began to grow more and more vegetables. In fact, for 5 years, the vegetables just flowed down to the Threefold restaurant. Now, you have to remember that that restaurant was still functioning with lots of people, and for Ralph and Louise and Charlotte, they were spending most of their time down there, but really looking forward to the summers, because that's when more and more people would come out. They found ways to create rooms any which way they could, as people would come and spend some days there at a time. In 1929, Fritz Westhoff came out. He constructed a fascinating building with many different roof lines on it. It came to be lovingly called the Green Garage, where there were cars down below and there were rooms up above. In 1930, it was decided that they needed to widen out that brook, and a steam shovel came in and dug out what we know of as the pond. So all this activity was happening in the summers out there in Threefold. Meanwhile, things were hopping in New York City, and in 1928 they decided they needed a bigger place. So they went down the street to go to a place that wasn't in the basement, but was up on the ground floor level. You can walk by it today and still see the arched windows that brought in so much light to this building. A lot of work had to be done, though, so Ralph Courtney went up to the German Labor Exchange and found a man named Carl Schmidt, a German woodworker who hadn't been here very long. I don't think his English was very good, and he brought him down to work with them on transforming this really into a restaurant. Fritz Westhoff came and built more tables and more chairs, and it became a bigger thing. Ultimately, up to 200 people could be served in any one evening. Now, it was about 1930 that Carl Schmidt was asked to come out to the farm and to begin work on the main house and expanding it. So they raised the roof. The characteristic gables that we see were created. So there were rooms upstairs. One of them was called the King's and Queen's Room, which had a porch around it. The living room was created. Helena Duttman came out, and there, using what we now know as the living room as a dining area, she began to offer meals during summer times, and more people began coming out. Ralph Courtney and Charlotte Parker were truly citizens of the world. I mean, they had seen much of it. They had been in Europe in World War I. And above all, they had come to know Rudolf Steiner. And they'd become convinced that just however difficult the times, however dark corners there might be in the human soul, that the human spirit could shine brightly if it were allowed to flourish. And that, they felt, was really their task, to build a bridge between the anthroposophy of Europe and that which was unfolding over here in America, to make Threefold a place where people could study together, they could live together, they could do the arts, sciences, be involved in the soil, and above all, building community. And so they began to work closely with the Anthroposophical Society. In 1927, they joined the council. Charlotte Parker became the secretary of the Anthroposophical Society, working closely with Henry Munges. Now, Henry sent out letters at that time to everyone that he knew interested in anthroposophy. He got back some 60 people who agreed to become members of the Anthroposophical Society. So it was small, but it was growing, and he traveled to so many different groups. Henry Barnes later said that while some people might think that anthroposophy was just a kind of an immigrant to our shores, that you couldn't hear Henry Munges speak without feeling that it had something profoundly to say to this country, to speak to the ideals that are part of this continent. Henry also left to come with his wife Maud out to Threefold Farm, and he invariably stayed in the King's and Queen's room. Loved to sit up there looking out over the activities of people working on the gardens or doing eurythmy on the lawn. Fred and Alice Heckel moved out in 1933 when Paul Strominger went back to Europe, and they took over the farm. They also had a house built for them by Fritz Westhoff. And if you go over in that little lane near the pond, you will see several of Fritz's houses. Here we see where they're putting down the foundation for the Heckel house, and Fred is standing there, and Fritz is standing right behind him. They built houses for Fanny Combs, for Miss Chase from the Dalton School. So more and more of these homes began to be developed in those early years. Now, in 1933, that was really the depths of the Depression. The new president, Franklin Roosevelt. In Europe, you had Hitler, you had Stalin, the Japanese had invaded Manchuria. These were difficult times, challenging times. And now they began to think, what could we do there for the social healing and the greater sense of the need for the spirit in this country? Well, Ralph went down to Henry Munges and said, we're thinking, we were over at that summer school back a few years ago, over in England by Mr. Dunlap, and we're wondering if we shouldn't do something like that here. Well, Henry was very excited about that, so he immediately raised money so that they could bring over people such as Ernst Lehrs and Maria Rurschel from Europe. Ralph and Charlotte knew that they wanted Ehrenfried Pfeiffer to come. Now, they had been over for the opening of the Goetheanum, the second Goetheanum in 1928, and there they had met Pfeiffer, who was eager to show him his laboratories and to take him up into the fields. So they piled into his car where he drove in his customarily reckless manner, came around a corner and actually smacked into a bulb. They somehow survived that. And they were impressed by the work that was being done in his laboratory. There they met Erika Sabart, Matilda von Frogstein, both of whom would later come to work with Dr. Pfeiffer in the Threefold Farm. And so it was that in July of 1933, the first annual summer school took place at Threefold. A big tent was put up back in the Oak Grove, back behind what is now Holder House. And Alice Heckel, together with Margaret Selke, they became called the Dutch Cleanser Twins, getting everything just right for it. 21 tents have been put up on the other side of the road, and there they'd be going, bringing blankets and pillows. They came over to the main house to work there. Constance Ling came down to supervise the main house. She made sure there were flowers in every room. And then gradually the day approached On that Saturday, when over 100 people began to descend on the Threefold Farm, Ralph Courtney cranked up his roadster and made many trips over to the train station in Spring Valley, a couple miles away, and would bring back group after group. Others found their own way there. And by the evening, people piled into the tent. And there they sat to hear the first speaker was Dr. Christoph Linder, who spoke on anthroposophical medicine. Now, in good Waldorf fashion, people slept on it before there was a conversation, but they came back the next morning and there was over 90 minutes of questions and answers on the medicine. And after that, Maria Rochel spoke. Then there was artistic activity. Henry Barnes remembers going over to the summer kitchen where they pushed all the tables aside and where he moved in eurythmy with Miriam Wallace and women of, as he called it, indeterminate age, who knew so much more eurythmy than he did. When that was over, the tables were brought back and other people descended from other corners of the farm to come to lunch, to have a meal of vegetables that were grown right there on the farm. You could come for $20 for a week, room and board in the main house or one of the other rooms. It was $13 if you stayed in the tent. And people just enjoyed those hours that they had in the afternoon to go walking along the paths, lined with hollyhocks and phlox done by Charlotte Parker, having meaningful conversations, a dip in the pond perhaps. At 4:30, the artistic events would continue. And then in the evening, Aaron Fried Pfeiffer gave the keynote address. He spoke about something called biologic dynamics. But he didn't only speak about the soil and about preparations, but something else that had been doing in their laboratories. An indication had come from Rudolf Steiner that if you want to show how the etheric manifests into the world, you could take substances and find the right kind of reagent, which they did. And out of that, these crystalline patterns would appear that would show the health, perhaps, of a plant substance. Now, he had a marvelous way with the English language in which certain phrases people would stumble over. After he spoke, some people were asking, what did he mean by the goats of the pasture? Well, this got to Aaron Fried, who just laughed and said, oh, no, the goats of the past, the gods of the past. Now, as those days went on, the many memorable events. So one of them, Anne Stockton had her little dachshund with her. She tied up to a tent post, and every time the rabbit would go by, and he would pull it, and the whole tent would shake. But those 2 weeks were felt to be profoundly meaningful to people. And I have to think that Charlotte Parker and Ralph Courtney and others must have felt a great satisfaction as it ended and the tent came down. And people went off to their own little corners of the country talking about what had happened there, looking forward certainly to the next year. That conference, that school would go on for some 35 years until well into the 1960s. They began to put little cabins up here and there, so small you could barely get a bed in them. The most exciting of them was actually what Margaret Selke did, because she took a bunch of lumber, walked over to an oak tree in the oak grove, climbed up and built herself a tree house. And she said later that they were the most wonderful summers of her life to be up there, perching up there and watching all the activity. More people came for longer periods of time. And over the years, they began to wonder if this couldn't become a place where people would really come and settle and stay year-round. So Ralph Courtney published a pamphlet called Your Own Vine and Fig Tree. It comes from the 4th chapter of Micah, that every man shall have his own fig tree, and he shall sit there and live his days in peace. And in it said, come to Threefold Farm, take a piece of land and put up a hut or a tent or perhaps a solid house. Come and live there, do art or do your writing, and live with people and study together in people there on the farm. But the fact is that life was still very, very busy down there in New York City. They were still deeply involved in the restaurant. And so for most people, it was just a matter of being there in the summers. Well, Charlotte Parker in 1935 purchased another piece of land. You had to go down a little ways. There was a gap, but on the other side, across from Raymond Avenue, the new land was purchased on which there was a white farmhouse and a red barn. If you went past it, you went up a hill, and then you went off into the fields, which go all the way to what is now the Christian community. That became the new land, and it became a place where people could come and they could settle.